I remember an afternoon when the snow was still clinging to the barbed wire like a stubborn memory. The women came in small groups, shoulders hunched against the cold, uniforms taken from wardrobes that no longer fit the rhythm of civilian life. They arrived with their hands full of letters that had grown thin from being read so many times, with scarves knotted the way mothers taught them, and with eyes that had seen too many trains and too many farewells. They were German women, a mixture of auxiliary workers, nurses, helpers who had been caught in the sweep of the war and transported across an ocean to an unexpected place, an American POW camp somewhere in the Midwest. The camp was orderly, patrolled, and in one way that surprised many, centered around a rhythm that Americans held dear, the ritual of the meal. If you were to ask which part of camp life threaded itself into every other memory, old or new, the answer would come without hesitation: the food. Not because it was extravagant, far from it, but because it was constant, tangible, and intimate. Food was tiny griefs and small mercies. It was the way a woman measured time by how long she had gone without a warm roll. It was how recipes from home were whispered and traded like contraband. It was also where the Geneva Convention and human decency met the practicalities of kitchens. The mess hall was a long, plain building with rows of metal tables and benches. In the middle of the room stood the serving line, a steel counter behind which American cooks moved with efficient economy. Many of the cooks were GIs who could make a good stew out of almost nothing, often African American men whose names the German women would come to know and respect. They stirred great kettles, ladled out soups, and slid trays of bread onto carts that clattered down the aisles. The smell of coffee, strong and slightly bitter, threaded through the air. Coffee was the first comfort. For many of the women, their last clear memory of home included coffee brewed thick and rich. This was a reminder that taste could survive displacement. Breakfast was bread and coffee and sometimes canned preserves. The bread was American lighter and different from the heavy rye and dense loaves they remembered from home. At first they called it white bread, with a small guilt that it wasn't what their mothers had known. And then they learned to toast it, smother it in jam from a Red Cross parcel, and fold a slice around a piece of canned ham to fashion a sandwich that felt like a defiant little pleasure. The Americans supplied rations that roughly equaled portions given to their own soldiers. That was part of the camp's rule, and it mattered. Each woman received a metal tray and a tin cup. The daytime menu often featured stews, thick pots of meat and beans, sometimes with potatoes and a few carrots. The meat was frequently canned or corned. It carried the steady saltiness of preserved food. It did not taste like home. It tasted of survival and of something made to last the long road. For many of the women, a bowl of stew was a lesson in making peace with unfamiliar textures. Spoon by spoon, they learned to appreciate the warmth and the way a carrot softened into a sweet nub under the broth. Potatoes became the camp currency of comfort. Mashed, boiled, roasted when there was a supply of fat, they were the closest thing to the fields of their childhoods. When the cooks had a day's bounty of potatoes, they turned them into mashed mountains, steaming and smooth, dotted with a pat of margarine that looked like butter but melted with the same promise. On good days there was gravy, dark and savory, poured over those mounds like an offering. Bread, potatoes, beans, coffee, and canned meats were the backbone. But people invent richness out of necessity. The women tended to the small things: a few dried herbs traded for a cigarette, a bar of Red Cross chocolate broken into quarters and savored. Parcels from the International Red Cross were treasured like letters from a far shore. They contained small miracles: tinned sardines, condensed milk, jam, chocolate, sugar, tea, cigarettes, and occasionally dried fruits. Those parcels were communal property, in many ways opened and portioned, with a sharp little economy of fairness. An orange or a little tin of fruit would be divided into enough pieces so that every woman at the table could hold a sliver and close her eyes while the sweet, sun-bottled taste passed briefly through her. There were other comforts that Americans provided, too. Holiday meals were an American custom the women grew to know. Thanksgiving, surprising as that felt, came with roast turkey when the supply allowed. A memory like that is indelible: a thinly roasted turkey, a bird that had been brined and basted and presented with reverence. The women, who had spent years without such a feast, fell into a hush that was not altogether sorrowful. They passed plates, offered second helpings, and translated gratitude into small thanks spoken in chipped German and earnest gestures. Christmas brought sugar cookies sometimes, And if the nurses on staff had baked, you might find a cake. Those occasions were not triumphalist. They were human. They acknowledged the strangeness of being fed by a former enemy and the larger humanity of shared tables. The kitchen itself was a strange world. While the main cooking was done by American personnel, camps often had German cooks working under supervision. It was an arrangement shaped by both practicality and law. Prisoners could prepare some of their own food if supervised. These women learned to work American ranges and enormous kettles. They discovered that stirring a cauldron for 10 hours required patience and a certain methodical strength. Some of them, once able to handle knives and pans freely, started to adapt recipes from home to the ingredients at hand. Cabbage, abundant in tin form in winter or fresh in the garden areas, became a linchpin. Sauerbraten was a memory reassembled as best as possible. A stew of meat and vinegar replaced with canned beef, and a vinegar-driven gravy that tried to mimic the tang of the old place. A sauerkraut substitute, slow steeped with a can of pork and a bay leaf, could prod a homesick palate into a small smile. Gardens were another lifeline. Camps often set aside land for growing vegetables, a practical move, both to supplement rations and to keep prisoners occupied. Rows of potatoes and beets looked familiar, and turning over the soil with calloused hands was as much therapy as it was food production. Women tended these plots, and in the summer months, bean vines and tomatoes climbed wisely, their fruit stolen in quick handfuls between head counts. Fresh tomatoes were treasures once they ripened, juicy and almost sinful to taste after months of tinned fruit. When the season allowed, the women canned and pickled extras, making schedules of jars with neat paper labels in German that my narrator, an old woman telling the story at a reunion table, can still recite by heart. There were also work details that carried them beyond the camp fence. Some women were assigned to nearby farms or local canneries, under guard, of course. Those assignments were both a reprieve from the mess hall and another world of food. Morning's labor could be followed by a farmhouse supper, a plate of beans and a pork chop, a thick slab of homemade bread, coffee brewed stronger than the mess halls and sweetened to the taste of a home kitchen. Those evenings left impressions. A woman named Marta, a character in my imagined chorus who seems very real to me now, spoke of a kindly American farmer's wife who taught her how to make a proper gravy from pan drippings. The farmer's wife had 3 daughters, and they spoke slowly in words that the German women could parse. Over that gravy, languages smooth, and a human exchange that had nothing to do with flags or politics took place. Sugar was precious. Rationing in Germany had taught them to savor sweet things in small portions. In camp, sugar was doled out. Jam was a luxury. Even coffee, although available, was measured, and some mornings a woman guarded her mug like a relic. Cigarettes also were a communal currency. A cigarette could be traded for a scrap of bacon or a piece of chocolate. Those little economies made sense in wartime. They also created social bonds and minor inequities. The absence of certain things was as noticeable as what was present. There was no fresh fish for those who had grown up near the sea. There were no delicate pastries that melted like memories on the tongue. Spices were scarce. Nutmeg and cardamom, cloves and bay leaves, the holy trio of many German kitchens were often missing. A woman who had once been a baker found herself consoled by the smell of yeast in makeshift bread, even if the bread's crumb was not as fine. For some, the most painful thing was the small, unavoidable difference in taste. American salt, different blends of fat, sugar that clung to the teeth in tiny crystals, all these created an unfamiliar culinary landscape. Illness and diet were also intertwined. Medical staff watched diets carefully. Many of the women had suffered from the lean years of war, and in camp they were weighed, fed, and rehabilitated according to medical needs. For those with conditions like anemia, iron-rich foods were emphasized. For dental problems, soft foods and soups were prepared. The camp's medical kitchen could make broths more nourishing than the regular mess bone broths that were both restorative and rich in memory, reminiscent of maternal labs of care back home. There were acts of kindness, small and large. Once, a food shipment arrived late. The cooks, not able to serve their usual ration, improvised. They made a simple bake of flour, water, and whatever cabbage they had a halting, flat bread, and served it warm with a smear of jam. The women ate in near silence, and afterwards one of them began to sing. Not a political song, but a lullaby. The melody curled around the benches, and the American cooks paused to listen. In that moment, the camp seemed less like a place of custody and more like a transient community held together by shared human habits. There were rules, too, that made the food experience clinical at times. The cooks kept inventory, accounted for portions, and made sure that nothing could be used for purposes outside food. No private trading with guards was allowed, at least not officially. And yet, in human nature's steadiness, bartering happened. A seamstress might trade a mended coat for a jar of jam. A woman who had a talent for bringing out a crisped edge on the camp's flatbread might earn a cigarette or a few squares of chocolate. These exchanges were never about greed. They were ways to restore dignity in a setting where so much had been removed. The food also carried memory and identity. When someone toasted slices of bread over a small flame, a contraband luxury sometimes permitted in quiet corners, they would talk of the old recipes, of grandmother's hand guiding dough into shapes, of the way a Sunday roast looked when the table was laden and the kids were noisy. The stories were longer than the recipes. The names of spices and the method of folding dough were outgrowths of whole household universes. Cooking became storytelling. The women taught one another to roll a perfect dumpling or to fold cabbage leaves for a stuffed roulade. And as they did, the lessons were stitches on a fabric that time had threatened to unravel. Towards the later months, with the war winding down and the machinery of repatriation beginning to hum, food acquired another meaning. It became a marker of safety and a bridge to the outside world. The Americans, who had once seemed distant and stern, sometimes invited a group of women to a community meal at a nearby town. They tasted home-cooked pies, apple and blackberry, and marveled at how fruit could still be tart and bright. Those pies felt like a promise, a signal that the world beyond the fences had its own rhythms and that those rhythms were not empty of kindness. When the day of departure came, a small parade of not very tidy suitcases and hand-sewn parcels lined up by the bunks. People brought with them the jars they had canned, little packets of tobacco, and in some secret places, a keepable recipe scrawled on a scrap of paper. The last meal in camp was hardly a feast. It was the ordinary. A final portion of bread and margarine, a cup of coffee that tasted like all the others, and a slice of canned peach distributed with formal care. They ate slowly, and then the sound of spoons on metal faded into a hush. Years later, when those women gathered for reunions or when their children asked about the strange chapters of their lives, they would still talk about those meals. They would describe the way a can of condensed milk could be transformed into a custard-like warmed treat, or how a cup of soup could be an emotional anchor on a gray afternoon. Some would confess that the American bread had become a comfort, that the mashed potatoes had stayed with them as a memory of a place that had tried, despite the circumstances, to keep standards. There are images that linger: a woman breaking apart a tin of sardines with tremulous fingers, the spread of jam over bread like a map of small joys, a soldier ladling stew into a bowl with a practiced swivel of the wrist, the quiet barter between neighbors across a table. There are also the paradoxes being fed by an enemy, receiving kindness wrapped in strict rules, tasting generosity within a situation governed by conflict. If I could sum it up for someone who remembers the war years and the rations, I would say this: the food in those camps was not about culinary excellence. It was about constant human nourishment. It was about the way a hot bowl could steady hands that had held very little warmth for a long time. It was about the way a slice of jammed bread could bind together stories of home that felt like they might otherwise dissolve. For the women who survived that strange passage, food became a ledger of both loss and resilience. They learned to coax flavor from the modest, to celebrate extraordinary generosity in a single fragrant turkey, to trade and to give, and ultimately to carry home recipes that were new versions of old comforts. The gardens they tended taught them patience and the faith that, come spring, the earth would answer the care they gave. Memory tricks you. It softens edges and sharpens others. When they later described the camp kitchens, they sometimes blended the stern reality with the warmth they felt from human kindness. Food, more than any other part of their experience, served as a bridge across the gulf between wartime enemies and the slow, stubborn possibility of reconciliation. In the end, the taste of freedom of bread, eaten in a train car bound for home, of coffee poured into a cup that did not have to be guarded, of a proper slice of rosehip jam on toast, was a small, perfect thing. It was a last bite that said they had survived. Years on, when the women now elderly passed around a jar of jam at a reunion, or when a son asked why his mother kept a faded Red Cross lid in a drawer, they would smile with the peculiar tenderness of survivors. They would remember the stew, the potatoes, the canned meat that tasted of salt and preservation, the garden tomatoes that felt like sunlight, and the shared slice of chocolate that became a communal sacrament. They would remember, too, the Americans who cooked and the farmer's wife who taught her proper gravy, and how these small human acts had altered the course of a cold winter. If you, who were there or who grew up in that era, listen closely, you can still hear the faint clinking of metal spoons against the tin. You can feel the steam rise from a bowl of soup and smell coffee brewed in a world that no longer exists. And you can remember how, once upon a winter night at a fenced place in the middle of America, a simple meal could make everything else a little easier to bear.